Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. Very nice crowd for a very interesting speaker and a very interesting topic. I'm Larry Quirk. I'm the treasurer of the Wyck Brooks Historic District. I'm also the chairman of the City of Plainfield Historic Preservation Commission. First of all, I'd like to thank Sarah Hull, who's sitting back there and is doing the technical, but really helped us out getting this program together. Sarah works and is the local history department, which is diagonally across the library there. She's a wonderful resource, as is her department. And you can do it online and in person. So you could sit in your pajamas and do it. Sarah does ask, however, if you come into the library, you do not wear your pajamas. It's a small rule, okay? The Wyck Brooks Historic District, and this is a little plug, so there's always an ad, you know, with everything. We are the largest of the 6 residential historic districts in Plainfield. There are 10 historic districts in the city. We comprise about 158 homes in about a 22 square block area. The library is actually sitting on the edge of the Wyck Brooks District. We are all back past the park and that way. And I would urge you, if you're not from Plainfield, or even if you are from Plainfield, take a look around the area. West 8th, which is on this side of the library, was known as Millionaires Row. And you can still see some wonderfully grand houses just by driving down the street. So it's a wonderful thing to do. Another plug, if you want to get inside of some of these wonderful houses, on December 15th, there's going to be a house tour, Christmas house tour. Here in Plainfield, there are flyers on the back table that will provide you all the information. I'm a house tour addict. Many of you may be as well, but you know, it's something that I think you should really do if you have the opportunity and the time. 2 little housekeeping chores. Please silence your cell phones or put them on airplane mode or silence or whatever things we do these days. So that it won't disturb Chris's talk. And if you need the bathroom, they're at the top of the stairs right here. I have a small, outside of that, I think we can proceed right to what you want to hear, Chris Gend. And just so you know a little bit about Chris, I have some information. He is a senior associate and adaptive reuse market lead at Pay Cobb Freed and Partners Architects. As one of the firm's leading designers, Chris has collaborated on many of the firm's most significant recent projects in Europe, India, and the United States, including the repositioning of 1271 Avenue of Americas, the former Time Life building. Chris discovered the architect E.G.W. Dietrich while researching and writing the successful National Register nomination of the circa 1893 John and Doris Mollenhauer House in Bayshore, New York. For the last 12 years, his rigorous and enthusiastic research of the architect has resulted in the documentation of more than 450 of Dietrich's designs, with visits to his built projects in 6 states. Chris has presented his research and introduced Dietrich to communities in New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and lucky you, for the first time in New Jersey with this presentation, which we're very glad about. And I welcome Chris Gend.
All right, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, great. So it's my great pleasure to be here in Plainfield. This has been on my radar for a very long time. I've sort of been stalking Plainfield, coming to look at some of the Dietrich designed houses that are here. And it was really a pleasure to come and get in touch with the library, with Sarah here, and also with Larry, to sort of bring my research and interest in Dietrich with sort of the built work that's here in Plainfield. And of course, one of the interesting things that comes about from that too is then his relationship with Marsh. So the title of the presentation that you can see is 2 Architects, 2 Brothers, and 2 Houses. And it was really me trying to grapple with how do we put together a presentation that's going to be interesting but handles the work of two different architects that were separate and never worked together. And so the interesting coincidence that happens is that if we go forward, you can see there were these two houses, and this was really the starting point where my work in Plainfield came. And it was looking at the Sylvanus L. Schoonmaker or Schoonmaker house, circa 1897, and then also Questover, which was actually built by the other brother. So there were two brothers, and they each had houses designed and built. And so Sylvanus Schoonmaker was the younger brother. He was the one who built his house on Central Avenue and Stell. And then his brother, elder, who had served in the Civil War, was Captain Joseph Schoonmaker. And so it was really the two of these brothers that came to Plainfield and built these two houses. And it was this sort of interaction between the houses and the architects that I'm interested in. So the two architects, of course, that we're talking about, we have E.G.W. Dietrich and then A.L.C. Marsh. We'll start talking about Dietrich first. He was born in Pittsburgh in 1857, born on February 22nd. That's George Washington's birthday. And so he, of course, has the patriotic middle name of George Washington, given his birthday. He was the son of German immigrants, Jacob and Johanna Dietrich, and the oldest of 6 siblings. Interestingly, Jacob, his father served in the Civil War and had a very hard and difficult time during the war, ended up in a hospital where he was finally dismissed at the end of the war with some sort of injuries. And I think that really took a hard toll on his spirit at that point. He went back to Pittsburgh to be with his family and unfortunately turned to drinking. And Johanna actually filed for divorce in 1874. And you can imagine at that time period, that must have been very scandalous and not something that typically happened. And so right from the beginning, Dietrich, being the oldest son, had to really step up and sort of take care of the family, support his other siblings. His mother owned several properties and was able to earn money for the family, sort of renting and organizing these boarding houses. But Dietrich right away had some skills, and he was a very talented in terms of drawing, drafting, painting. And so right away, you can see this artwork that he did from 1879. This drawing is currently held by the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh. And so it's the earliest drawing of Dietrich's that we have, even though it's not actually one of his designs. He basically did this, I think, as a drafting or drawing exercise in the very beginning, copying a home that he saw in one of the architectural periodicals. And then he did, his own tests trying to, master his drawing skills. He attended the Western College of Pennsylvania, in addition to Duff's Business College. And that's really where he learned his basic skills of drafting and working under some architects that were professors there. And then later on, he went to do an internship with them. 2 of which were James Drum and David Kuhn. So after this internship period from 1882 to about November of 1883, he was working for the architect James T. Steen. Steen designed the YMCA building in Pittsburgh, a very ornate building. Dietrich did all of the drawing for that. So he was really getting his skills and honing his work as an architect and as a designer. In terms of his personal life, in 1884 in November, Dietrich married Eliza Estelle Melhorn. She was the daughter of a very well-known Reverend John K. Melhorn. He was a Lutheran minister, and he was very prominent in that part of Pennsylvania, starting a lot of smaller churches in the rural communities and then also heading up a large church in Pittsburgh itself. So you can see in this photograph from 1898, sort of the Dietrich family all assembled together. The 6 boys, they're just like little steps almost on a staircase they're going down. The last one, youngest George, was born in 1900, so he's not pictured. But otherwise, here are all the sons and the Dietrich family. So in 1883 to 1886, Dietrich was in practice with Charles Bartberger. And Charles Bartberger was the son of another Charles Bartberger who had immigrated from Germany and actually was a very well-known architect already in Pittsburgh. He had designed the main cathedral building in the city and had done many, many projects, especially churches at that time. So really when Charles Elder, when his son came back from his training in Germany, where he trained to be an architect, they basically met up and Dietrich and Bartberger worked together. And I think through the course of their practice, everybody in Pittsburgh has told me that really it was Dietrich always that had the design sense and did all of the drawing. And Bart Berger was more about the contacts and the business people. So I want to introduce, before we get too far, some of the styles that we're going to be talking about today. So one of those is the shingle style. So in this time period that we're looking at right now, about the late 1870s through the 1890s, this style was extremely popular and came to prominence in North America. It was special here. It wasn't like a style that came from Europe that was imported. It was really a homegrown design style that turned back and looked to sort of colonial architecture, but not necessarily the formal colonial we think of. It's more looking at the vernacular, some of the barn buildings or the back sides of houses or the simple, more farmhouse design. And so it was looking at these irregular shaped masses, the shingle work that was obviously used. So asymmetry becomes important to this. So does the shingle work itself. Architects were starting to group fenestration together, placing the windows in lines rather than tall vertical windows like we think of in earlier Victorian styles. And also at this point in time, architects and society as a whole was looking to nature. So there was, of course, the movement about bringing nature inside the house, not being so cooped up inside, trying to sort of fight against some of the diseases that had taken place. And so we have porches, piazzas, and loggias. So it's really trying to open up to the exterior and bring nature inside and also bring living spaces out. And just really quickly, I want to tell you a quote by Dietrich. This was published in in American Builder and Woodworker magazine in 1887. It was from his essay, Cobblestone Building. The design should not be one of those gingerbread-looking designs, but should be a bold treatment and outline, shorn of all unnecessary detail, such as flimsy cornices and other unnecessary effects on the part of a designer to spoil a bold roof line or wall space. So what's really happening here is Dietrich is looking at taking away the mass-produced ornamentation and just taking the building back to its basic forms and using that to express the architecture. The time period that we're talking about here, really, this is a quote from him in 1887, but it would have really been beginning about the 1870s, let's say, and then sort of starting in Boston and New England, and then kind of coming up and down the East Coast in terms of that shingle style aesthetic. And then that was popular, I would say, going into about 1900 or so. And as you'll see, as we keep going, sort of the shingle style starts to merge a little bit with colonial revival, and we get some really interesting hybrid designs. So one example of Dietrich's work with Bart Berger in Pittsburgh that really expresses this idea is the Macbeth House, built in 1884. You can see a drawing of it here. Mr. Macbeth was a very successful industrialist in Pittsburgh. And this is how the house looks today on the outside. And interestingly, I had seen drawings and photos, but the first time I visited this house, it's actually not wood shingles, it's slate. And so it's just absolutely amazing to get up close to this, and you sort of get the sparkle and crystal, and to see the work that must have been involved in cutting these stone pieces and hanging them on the outside of the building. But you can really see here the asymmetry of the house. You can see the dramatic lines of the roof, and not a lot of ornamentation that you would picture in earlier houses or other houses that are being built by other architects at this time period. Another project that I'd like to show you is from 1885. This is the Court and Matilda Williams house. This is in Cincinnati on Upland Place. This is how the house looked, not quite today, how it looked a couple of years ago. This house has since been actually renovated. Miraculously, the owners took all of the siding off and the shingles were still underneath, in addition to all of the porch railings. It's phenomenal. So they've done a great project renovating it. I'm going to get there to photograph it soon. But again, you can see a lot of the features that I just mentioned before, the asymmetry and the dramatic roof lines, and again, sort of these open balconies and porches to connect with nature. But on this house, one of the really impressive things is the interior. And you can see here this amazing woodwork. The corbels actually at the door openings that you see have these interesting spiral patterns that have been in the woodwork. None of them are the same. Each one is completely unique throughout the house. And so I think this is Dietrich really at sort of his young stage, where he's just drawing whatever he can and making it interesting and creating these amazing shapes and forms. But just of note, this spiral pattern that you see is something that he will bring through again and again in his projects. And you'll notice if you go to see a Dietrich house, somewhere in there, there will be these spirals, these concentric circles that are used as sort of his trademark as a decoration throughout the interior. So what happens and what really starts to make Dietrich's career take off is in 1884, 1885, in Warwick, New York, he received a commission for 2 houses on the main street there. And these 2 homes stand side by side. They were designed for cousins. And I just want to read you an excerpt from the newspaper right after they were completed. Situated on the western side of South Main Street stand 2 houses which attract the attention of all who pass along the street. So entirely unlike are they from what the eye is accustomed to see, and so pleasing to the lover of picturesque effect in color and outline, that one never tires in studying them, always finding some new point of interest. So it wasn't just the newspaper that found these houses attractive, but this really brought attention to Dietrich from all over the place. People would travel to Warwick, the newspaper's report, to see these houses, study them, and then hire Dietrich to come and design houses for them. So of course, the problem is Dietrich was in Pittsburgh working, and of course, this was all happening in Orange County, just up the Hudson River from New York. So the first house was designed for Clinton and Martha Wisner, and Clinton Wisner was very wealthy. He came from a wealthy family to begin with colonial roots. He then also increased his fortune through work in Scranton and, of course, industries at the time. And he eventually became mayor of Warwick, the village. So that also brought sort of more of a connection of Dietrich to that place. You can see here what that house looked like when it was first completed. It's very interesting to note sort of these arches that are on the porch, this sort of large arch, small arch pattern that we see. Also at the end, you'll see of the porch, the sort of arches that are going into the air, the sort of incomplete arch. And of course, again, a lot of focus on the roof and the gable work. The interior of the house, the photos that we do have, you can see it has sort of an arts and crafts almost aspect to it. I think these are probably from some later interventions that came along. 1884, 1885 would have been quite early for that. But we do know that both Dietrich and the owner kept sort of working and making changes to the house over time. This is how the house looks today. The name of the house is right on the side. It's called the Anchorage, and you can have a look. And originally, the bay window that you see here was a porch that was enclosed in one of those later alterations. And then right next door, Wisner's cousin, Louise, she had her home built, which was called Dulce Domum. And again, it's very similar. The houses really do complement each other. This house, again, is similar a little bit to the one that we saw in Cincinnati. You can see that porch up at the top gable. And again, sort of this mixing of the inside and outside space. So with all the attention that Dietrich had gained through the construction of these houses in Warwick, being introduced to the different business people that Mayor Wisner had, it really made sense for Dietrich to leave Pittsburgh and come to New York City. So in 1886, he ended his partnership with Bart Berger, and he established an office at 294 Broadway. And this is actually a view of Broadway right at that time period. So you can imagine what it would be like coming from Pittsburgh here to the big city. He started his first office in New York, but he lived in Bloomfield, New Jersey originally, and then after that moved to Brooklyn. Through the years in Dietrich's practice, he was associated with several different architects. There was Morris Stuckert, there was Manley Cutter. You can see the list here that's on the screen. Julius Deemer was one towards the end of his career. They did a lot of churches together. But Dietrich was always the design voice in the practice. So it's really his hand that you can see carry through all the projects. So I want to take you to see a house that's in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, just outside of Scranton. And you might remember Louise Wisner, the one house from Warwick I just showed you. Well, she ended up getting married to a person named Thomas Jones, and this is the house they built in Scranton together. They hired Dietrich to design it. And these are the original drawings, and it's called appropriately Fieldstone. And you can see from the drawings how appropriate with all of the stonework that's there. This is how the house looked when it was completed, and a view of the house as it looks today, still very much intact. Thankfully, there was a photo book from the family that I was happy to come across. And so we do have some wonderful interior photos of the house. The entry hall is in the upper left. You can see the beautiful stained glass windows on the staircase. And this house really in plan shows all of the aspects of sort of the very mature and now shingle style house that's being built for a wealthy family. So there are many rooms. The entry hall is not sort of a formal, long, straight space. It's really being used as a room by this point. And additionally, sort of one room opens to the next, and this connection to the outdoors, you can see this giant porch that is wrapping around the house. And it really is wonderful to be there and have this interaction between the inside spaces and the outside. So I want to come now actually to our first connection between Dietrich and Plainfield. The Evans family was local here to Plainfield and owned a large estate called Oakwood, which was on Plainfield Avenue. And John Evans was actually the second mayor, I believe, of Plainfield from 1871 to 1872. So this was his estate. And Mayor Evans had two sons that had a connection with Dietrich. The first one was Cortland DeLacy and his wife Clara, and he actually moved down and lived in Maryland, in Baltimore, and he built a country house outside in Ruxton, and you can see that house here at the left. Dietrich designed this house for Cortland and his wife, and this is really one of the important early designs by Dietrich that he would keep working on and finessing throughout his career. So you can see it has that gable with the gambrel style on it. It's got these beautiful dormer windows, again, the porch and stonework. So these are things that really become a tradition through Dietrich's work. Sure.
Is that Oakwood family estate in Plainfield still standing?
I believe it is still standing, and it was used as a school, I believe, for some time.
Yes.
I'd have to look that up. It's on Plainfield and no, I believe the only thing that's left maybe is the main rectangular box shape of the house. I believe the turrets and the porches and everything were stripped off. So it's really in a much more basic state now.
There are some outbuildings still.
Correct. But Dietrich did not design that house. The house was already there. And I don't know that he directly had any interaction with Evans himself. It was just the sons that he came into contact with. The second son is Clark Wright Evans. Clark Wright Evans was an interesting person. He had a lot of different things, but towards the end of his career, he decided to become an architect. And so he actually worked in Dietrich's office as an architect first here in New York. Then he ended up moving to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, where he met his wife, married, and settled down. And then Dietrich ended up having a commission in Wilkes-Barre, and he hired Clark Wright Evans to be the architect kind of locally to oversee the project. And then after that, basically Evans on the beautiful house that you can see here, which was the shoemaker house, it then turned into a practice for him. He was an architect for many years. And in fact, that practice through new people still survives to this day. Nearby to Plainfield in Somerville in 1890, we have a house for Edwin Scott. And you can see the original drawing for the house on the left, and then on the right-hand side, a historic photo. There was an earlier house in Brooklyn similar to this that Dietrich designed that had this large conical tower. And you can see the original drawing, they took it away, but then the owner wanted it back, so they ended up putting it in the final design. This is how the house looks today. Again, the porte cochere is still intact, the tower is there, and you can see the detail in the close-up of all the varied sort of shingle work that you see. There are these interesting sort of razor blade cut shingles that are just really quite dramatic. On the interior, I was really excited when I saw the interior, because the left is a fireplace drawing by Dietrich for a house that was actually on Long Island. And then as I went to tour this house for the first time, I saw that, oh my gosh, here is the exact fireplace. That the fireplace on Long Island had been ripped out, it had been changed, but here is one of the original ones, and you can see exactly the similarity. And then also as a key feature of many Dietrich designs, the dramatic staircase and stained glass windows. So I want to jump ahead now a little bit and talk about the Colonial revival. So one of the things with all of these architectural terms and styles we talk about, they're terms that we've come up with today. They're not how they would discuss houses of the time period. So we like to organize and categorize everything into a very clear category. But of course, back then, there was a lot of blurring of the lines, and houses were being built with elements from each as time evolved. So as we organize it today, Colonial revival, and specifically in our case, Georgian revival, really changes from that shingle style. So we start to see more symmetrical massings of the houses. This is when you start seeing, again, kind of a central entry, a very formal facade, equal spacing of windows. There are large, impressive porticos. So these are not necessarily meant for you to like hang out underneath and enjoy, but they're more formal and stately. A lot of decorative fenestration. So we start seeing very fancy muntins in windows, circular windows, Palladian style half circle windows. Ornamental balustrades on the houses. So on tops of porches with no purpose, they're just really there for decoration. And finally, even the dormers themselves became very ornamental and decorative aspects of the houses. So one of those that really kind of bridges the gap between the shingle style and the colonial revival is called Nutwood, and it's in Morristown. And you can see some drawings of the house and its interior here. This is the exterior view of the house, also giving you the interior staircase and the foyer. But what's interesting is this starts to have a little bit of both. So you can see these now decorative windows really representing the colonial revival style, and yet sort of the rambling massing of the house, the prominent gables, give you more of an aspect of that shingle style again. So this is really kind of touching on both design styles. When it came to 1891, Dietrich decided to use the colonial revival for his own home that he built in Bensonhurst by the Sea in New York. This is a drawing and floor plans of the house. And even though the house has a more symmetrical massing on the exterior, you can see by looking at the floor plans that nothing has changed from the shingle style houses he had started out designing. So we still have, again, this sort of asymmetrical relationship of rooms. We have that entry hall that's really quite large and used as a living space as much as just for a space for circulation. But by the massing of the second floor and the overall porches, he kind of hides that asymmetry so that it has the covering of a colonial revival style house. So you kind of get the best of both worlds, I think. This is a view of the outside of the house after it was completed, and the interior entry hall stair, photograph, and then a drawing by Dietrich on the bottom. So I want to talk about the 1893 John and Doris Mollenhauer house in Bayshore. This is going back now. This is definitely in the shingle style category, even though it wasn't built until 1893. A drawing of the house as it looked when it was newly completed, and then a photograph of the house today. You can see again, like earlier, it has these sort of arches, beautiful shingle work on the arches for the porch that wraps around, and additionally, that magnificent staircase landing with stained glass. So one of the colonial style houses that he designed in Warwick, New York, was a country house for Solomon and Adelaide Johnson. This house is extremely impressive. Unfortunately, it's no longer standing, but we can take a look at a photograph of when it was completed, what it looked like. And you can imagine how much fun it would be to invite it to a party here on the weekend and hang out. It really had amazing spaces. Again, the porches wrapping around, the carriages would pull up under that double height porch there on the side. And similar in Cranford, in 1896, for William and Lucy Tripp, Dietrich designed this house. It's on Casino Avenue. The dormers have been changed in the current version from the original. The original house had these sort of circular windows at the top, but otherwise the house is largely intact. And one of Dietrich's most impressive shingle style houses, although very much kind of overlaid with this colonial revival design elements on top, is the Robert and Elizabeth Marvin house in Jamestown. This house is really impressive for its stonework. You can see the beautiful tower on the left-hand side that anchors the house in place. But then we have this sort of Palladian window at the top, bringing in some of those colonial revival elements to meet the shingle style. The interior of the house is extremely intact. It's being used right now by the Marvin House, which is a women's society in the town. So after the Marvins left, the house has never been touched or changed except for a few small interventions. So it really has many original details inside, which are of course phenomenal to see. In Scranton, again, the Platt House in 1898 is one I just wanted to show you, touching on some of Dietrich's work in brick. You can see here the beautiful, again, colonial revival elements, this ornamentation on the dormers and these lower windows. This is probably about as decorative as Dietrich would get in the colonial revival style. His use of it, although he incorporated the elements, tried to be more restrained. And I think that really comes from his work originally in the shingle style, that he was trying not to add more ornamentation than was required. These are the plans of the house, again, now sort of conforming more to that more rigid colonial revival style, more symmetry happening. But the interiors really are quite beautiful. This is all bird's eye maple woodwork going through the entry hall, which is quite stunning. Going back to that house again in Ruxton, Maryland, from the Evans family, this is a similar variation, although a little bit larger, that was built in Bayshore. You can see the house as it looked originally, and then when it was completed now. And the interior spaces also carried through now with the Colonial Revival interiors. This house is from 1900. And in Cranford, a little closer to home, we have a house that was built for Joseph and Ellen Sperry. Those of you familiar with, Cranford know the S&H story that exists from there. The Sperry family, the S&H green stamps was their sort of origin and where the family got a lot of their wealth from. So this house stands on Union Avenue there. And you can see again, that sort of archwork that we were talking about before, drawing of the house in the bottom right. So now I want to come to Plainfield's own son, of course, Augustus Lotham Clark Marsh. So he was an architect that came a little bit later than Dietrich. He was born in 1865. So there's about 8 years difference between the two of them. He was actually born in Cincinnati. His parents were Richard and Mary Marsh. He was the youngest of 7. But unfortunately, 3 older brothers right above him died when they were infants. So there's kind of a large gap in the family between the older siblings and then Augustus at the bottom. The family moved to Plainfield when he was only 2 months old. So he always claimed that he was a person from Plainfield, even though he was actually born in Ohio. Richard had served in the army for the Union during the Civil War, very similar with Dietrich's father. So the 2 architects had this in common. Unfortunately, he died in 1867 of tuberculosis. So it's actually interesting for these 2 architects. Another similarity is that they both had their fathers missing. So Dietrich, of course, because of the alcoholism and the divorce, and then Marsh because of his father passing away from tuberculosis. So I think the similarities between them, it's kind of interesting, this generation born right after the Civil War. One thing that was not at all common between them is the fact that the Marsh family goes back really to 1634, arriving in the US in Boston. And an interesting fact is that the Marsh family came and settled in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And I think it's Union County that we're in. They owned all of Union County, basically, this group of people that came and settled and took over there during the colonial era. So at one point in time, the Marsh family sort of had control over this whole area. That's why the name is something common around. And I believe that's probably why they might have come back to be near family again. They came from England. Yeah, they were English originally. And you can see the Marsh coat of arms here on the left-hand side. And then it's interesting, there's a census from 1870 that shows them as they had moved here with his parents. And of course, Augustus, they're 5 years old. So talking about his family life, he graduated from Plainfield High School, at least according to his obituary. When I looked through the Plainfield High School records, his name was not listed, his sister's was. So it's interesting if that's true or if he inflated that. When he was here, one of the things he was really into was cycling. And I think it's really hard for us today to understand what a big deal bicycling was at this time period back in the 1880s and 1890s. He held the record, which I think is something impressive, for the most miles ridden in one day for the Plainfield Bike Club, or maybe it was for New Jersey, 150 miles. And he would go cycling all the way to Pennsylvania. They would do these century trips that were 100 miles in one day. And we have to remember that there were no paved roads back then. So you're biking on gravel and who knows what else. And you can see they use these old-fashioned crazy bicycles. So this is Marsh here on the right-hand side.
Plainfield had a villa.
Oh, okay. But not to get you to Pennsylvania. So I think it's just really interesting that this was such a hobby. And I think what would happen is as everybody here knows, Plainfield was this wealthy resort area and gained more and more prominence as a wealthy resort area. And of course, one of the things that you did if you were wealthy and you came out of the city is cycling allowed you to get out and see the countryside. It was really an activity for the wealthy. And so that was something that he did on his weekends and spent his time doing. In 1898, he designed 2 houses on Hillside Avenue where he lived with his mother and sister. It wasn't until 1912 that he finally was married to Grace E. Weeks. And the interesting thing is there was a 22-year age difference between the 2 of them. So she actually lived very long into the 1980s after him. But they did have one daughter named Molly. She was born in 1913, just shortly after they were married. And he must have been speculating a little bit in real estate because, as most of you probably know, on Hillside, you can recognize there's a lot of Marsh houses around. And this pair that they lived in at 816 and 822 or 824, really, it seems like over the years in the different censuses, they flipped around between one house or the other and so on. So talking about his architectural practice, he really came to prominence in 1890 when he won a competition with the New York Sketch Club. And he got first place for this boathouse that you see drawn here on the left. And this architectural sketch club was sort of society and a gathering for young architects. But it's interesting because it carried through, and as these architects became successful in later life, they kept meeting and they kept this going as a sort of club between them. So there's some very prominent architects that were involved. And one of the architects that was directly in the sketch club with him was Charles Israels. And so he was basically an early partner that he had teamed up with. So it was basically Marsh, Israels, and Harder was the firm that came to be known, and they formed themselves in 1894. They only lasted for a few years until 1896. And I think maybe what happened is at that point in time, Marsh was being pulled more and more to his work in Plainfield because it was really his residential work here in New Jersey that he kept getting more and more commissions. And the rest of the office, they were more focused in Manhattan and in New York City. So even though Marsh kept an office in New York City almost until the end of his life, all of his work was more and more concentrated here in Plainfield and New Jersey in general. So later on in his career, he was Marsh and Get was the firm that was formed for about 8 years. That was with Otto Get. And then also through the years, there were other architects that he worked with. Most important, Charles H. Detwiller was one of the later architects, or one of the last. We, of course, owe the collection of materials here in the archive at the Plainfield Library to Detwiller's son. So it's an amazing collection, and we're very thankful, and it's a great connection that they had. So talking about Marsh's commercial work, two of the buildings I want to point to you, there was, of course, the old YMCA building here in Plainfield, and also this bank building that was built in Westfield. And both of these, if you just glance back at that design for the boathouse, you can see those conical towers, very dominant, the brick masonry. I sort of see a direct relationship as you come in and now see these commercial buildings that he worked on. But of course, the important houses, right? The residential work was really where Marsh had his bread and butter. These are those two houses I talked about that were the Marsh family residences on Hillside Avenue. You can see the floor plan here. One of the things I think that was just genius about his design work was really bringing proper, looking house for sort of modest means. This was something that the middle class and sort of upper middle class could build, and yet the house still had a very beautiful presence and had all of the elements and things that you would need to sort of have a very respectable, lifestyle. So you got a lot of bang for your buck with one of his houses, especially these sort of Dutch colonials that he would build over and over around Plainfield. So one of the places that this design work was very predominant was on Madison Avenue. You can see in 1904, actually, this great view looking down Madison, one after another. These are all Marsh houses that we see located here. And of course, pictures of the houses as they look today. The one in the middle that you see is actually the same design as the Marsh house that was on Hillside. The other two are different designs. And yes. So these are two other ones that you saw on each side, and these also repeat too. So where I think Dietrich was much more, I guess, original in all of his designs, and I think a lot of times had commissions of higher value. I think the just large output that Marsh was able to do building these houses over and over and over again around Plainfield really brought him success. And of course, they are beautiful homes, and the details inside also were extremely beautiful. Jumping up though in scale to some of the houses that he did that were a little bit for the more wealthy people in town. One of them, this house was called the Roses. It was built for Philip and Florence Van Wyck. It was at the corner of Stell and Plainfield Avenue. This house is interesting because it definitely has this hybrid mix again of sort of the Dutch colonial gambrel roof that we were talking about before, and then all of these colonial revival details, the balustrades, the decorated windows, the dormers. You can see on the interior, Marsh has carried all of those elements into the pediments over the doors, the beautiful columns that we see with these scamosi capitals, as they're called. So this was really something by 1898 that he's bringing that colonial revival design from the exterior into the inside of the home. So it wasn't just new construction that Marsh worked on, but part of Plainfield's success, and as things began to grow and more wealthier and wealthier families came, is they would take these prior standing houses and add on and keep making additions. And a lot of times making those additions changed the style of the house. So this is a house on Central at the corner of Randolph. And you can see here basically the way that the house, the plan. So the rectangle that you see in the middle was the original house. And of course, the front gable that we see added on with the gambrel roof and the two side wings were added by Marsh. And a picture as the house looks today.
There was a fire, that's why the third floor was.
Oh, okay. Then on Stell, this is just down the street. We have a beautiful colonial revival house, also by Marsh. You can see he did a matching carriage house in the picture on the right as well. The house as it looked in 1926 and very much looking similar today. So not only Plainfield, Marsh was working around the rest of New Jersey and New York as well. One significant house of his was in Jersey City for Albert and Sarah Drayton. This was 1902. And what's interesting with this house, I think, is that it has this beautiful cutaway corner that you see was turned into this lower and upper porch. And I just think that would have been such a beautiful space to take advantage of again when you were occupying the house. On the interior, you can see that the really richly appointed rooms on the inside. This again has those sort of colonial revival elements, but this is all rather than painted, it's in rich woodwork, which cost a lot more money and probably explained a little bit about the wealth of the family who built it. Although you can see the main entry hall staircase there, the arches, and the staircase that goes up. So this is one I just want you to put in the back of your head and remember, because we'll come back to it again. So I want to talk now about one of the families that I said. Again, we had the two houses, the two architects, the two brothers. So these are the two brothers. This is the Schoonmaker or Schoonmaker family. They came from Pittsburgh and basically were very successful. They're working in industries. You know, of course, there was the steel, there was the coal. And so basically the first brother, Joseph Schoonmaker, he was the older one, and then his younger brother, Sylvanus, that I mentioned. So that's Questover and the Coriell Mansion. But there were also other siblings that were in town. So on Madison Avenue, we had George B. Schoonmaker, who had this house that you see up here on the left. And then additionally, Mary Schoonmaker Andrews. So she was on Central Avenue. And in fact, the Schoonmaker's mother, after their father died in Pittsburgh, she came here to live and basically stayed the rest of her days with her daughter living here on Central Avenue. Their oldest brother stayed living in Pittsburgh, and that first house, the Macbeth house, they lived right around the corner. So it's kind of interesting the way these families were sort of all in with each other and had close connections. So I wouldn't be surprised if the connection between Dietrich being from Pittsburgh and the Schoonmaker family having their origins in Pittsburgh is perhaps how the families found each other and how Dietrich was hired to design the work. So he was hired to design the house that was located at the corner of Central and Stell for Sylvanus and Mary Schoonmaker. Property was built in 1896. The house was built between 1896 and 1897. And this is a picture of Mr. Schoonmaker that you see here. The drawing of the house, as you can see, has quite a bit of ornamentation in terms of the ornamental balustrades at the top of the porch. You can see the widow's walk at the top of the house, and of course, these magnificent columns wrapping all around. This is a photo of the house after it was completed. One of the elements missing from today, just for those of you that know, there was originally a porte cochere that projected on the front of the house that really must have been quite beautiful. I think it was probably taken away because cars wouldn't be able to fit through it later on. So that's one of the reasons that it came down. This is an interesting photo that I've recently come across at the Frick Archive in Manhattan at the Frick Museum. So basically, this is a photo of Mrs. Frick on the left and the Mary and Sylvanus Schoonmaker on the right. They're sitting right at the corner of the steps. You can see sort of the columns behind them, and they're on these curved stairs. So this photo is actually taken at the house. The Fricks and the Schoonmakers were very close friends with each other. Again, I think that goes back to their time in Pittsburgh. And then it also has to deal with the fact that they were in business together through the steel industry, through Carnegie and so on. So they were all very closely related, and the Schoonmakers really were traveling in very high circles. So this is a photo of the house as it looks today. You can see very much intact, missing some of the balustrades on the top, but otherwise in great condition. This is a photo of the back view. I wanted to include this just because not everybody gets to see this side of the house very often. And one of the things that I think is just very nice with this is you can see that projection and the way the porch sort of wraps around, contrasting. That's the family end in the front, and sort of the dining room is there. And then on the right-hand side, you have the kitchen staircase. And you can kind of see the difference between what the help in the kitchen gets versus what the rest of the family has access to. That porch off the dining room was glassed in at one point. This was designed by Dietrich after the house was finished. So you can see the glass panels as they would have been enclosed to use the house in the sort of shoulder seasons. Interestingly, these panels are still in the basement of the house, so perhaps it could be restored at one point. But in any case, the porch on the house is really breathtaking. It just is amazing, the spaces, the light. It's a very pleasant place. This is the original elevation view looking at the front of the house. And interesting to note is the decorative work that you see running across at the top just below the cornice. And of course, in the finished house, you see that is still there and intact. So it really is, again, Dietrich didn't like a lot of ornamentation. It was quite Spartan most of the time, but there was a little bit of these flourishes he would add in. Taking a look at the floor plan of the house, you can see the large rooms. Of note, on the back porch, there is a bicycle storage room, which I think is interesting. Mrs. Schoonmaker, just before the house was completed, they were already staying in a rented house here in Plainfield. She actually had a terrible bicycling accident where she was hit by another bicyclist and was laid up for a while. So this was something the wealthy people, everybody was getting out and doing. So they had to have their bicycle room included in the house. Also impressive to note is the main entry hall, reception room staircase. It's 18 by 40 feet. That's bigger than my apartment in Brooklyn. So it is a huge, huge, impressive space. So this was something that you came in, you were really well received and entertained. Important thing to note design-wise, you might not have seen from the outside, is that the porte cochere and the entry stairs and the sort of center of the house line does not align with the reception hall or the main front door. And a lot of people comment on this. Well, why isn't it lined up? Why isn't it symmetrical? And I think this goes back to Dietrich's shingle style work originally and not liking that symmetry, not needing to have that symmetry. So he was really almost using form and function originally a little early, trying to make the layout of the house work and then wrapping the envelope around the outside on the upper floors to give it that massing. But he wanted his first floor, why would you make the dining room and the parlor symmetrical when the dining room needs to be much bigger, obviously? And that was, of course, because parlors usually were segregated and men would go to one, women would. There's a billiard room up in the corner, so that's where you would go after dinner to have your cigars. This is a drawing of the entry hall by Dietrich, so you can see the sort of triple archway and the staircase and landing as you go up. This is a historic photograph when the Schoonmakers would have been living in the house of how it looked. And this is how the entry hall looks today, with still those arches in place and that beautiful landing up at the top. One of the things that I think is quite special, it's a little hard to tell, but there is a landing midway up. So as you're going up and down the stair, you really feel the graciousness of going just a few, steps up, and you have a pause and then a few more steps. Up on the landing itself, you can see the beautiful leaded windows that are in place here. This is just a magnificent area. There used to be a window seat here in the original design. And this is looking back from the staircase just at the front door. So the triple arches of the staircase are sort of mimicked in the triple arches of the entry and the two alcoves. The dining room is one of the other fantastic spaces on the main floor. These are drawings on the right-hand side by Dietrich of the dining room, and you can see as it was built in the photo on the left. So there is, of course, again, another archway over the main sort of buffet, which is tucked in on the side, and then another arch and pilasters that are next to the fireplace. And the house today still retains all of those elements. You can see the columns, some of the leaded glass windows are missing, but in general in very good shape, and some of the details on the far side there. So one of the key features of the second floor is if you thought the landing hall on the bottom was big, there's a huge giant stair hall on the second floor as well. So you come upstairs and all of these bedrooms are surrounding this giant second floor hall. And this would have been really special because it would have, again, functioned not just as a circulation space, but a living space. So people, if you were staying, you would be able to come out here, interact with other people at the house. This is a view of that second floor landing today. The third floor staircase there is not original. That was added later. So it would have been even bigger than it looks here in the photo. And I wanted to include, just because we have it thanks to the archive at the library, the third floor plan, because we usually don't get floor plans of this that would have been published in magazines. And the special feature here is that center stair, which actually goes up to the widow's walk on top. So they certainly would have used that at the time to bring guests and sort of get a look out over Plainfield. So taking a look at the census, this is really interesting because the top three names that we have are the Schoonmaker family. It was Sylvanus, Mary, and their son Frank. And then below that, it's all servants that were at the house. Or in the case of the coachman that lived in the carriage house, the servants, the coachman's family and his aunt even lived there. So the family of three was really supported by a large group of people that were all living in the house at the time. This is a photo of the family here. You can see Mr. and Mrs. Schoonmaker and their son Frank. Then in the corner up there, you basically have the Schoonmakers and the Fricks together. This is at the Fricks estate Eagle Rock, which was on the coast up in Massachusetts. And then you have Frank and his wife, so the young son, as he gets a little bit older, also at the Frick estate. And this was one of the things that the Schoonmakers, their money just kept getting bigger and bigger and their investments larger and larger. So they really did have quite a high society life. You can see one of the anniversary parties that was held for Mr. Schoonmaker's brother from Pittsburgh, all gathered together. They're here at Palm Beach, where they also had a house. They're with the Fricks again, bicycling still, which is great to see. And eventually then they sort of outgrew Plainfield. So Plainfield had its moment of being the place for the sort of wealthy to come out of the city. And by this point in time, they decided to relocate to Long Island. And I think that North Shore of Long Island after 1900 was really becoming the place to be. That's where you met with your business associates and families. You know, you played polo. It was really sort of a different generation that was taking over at that point. So the Schoonmakers went and they had a house, Rosebank, which was built in 1915. And I just started to do some numbers on this. So the house and the land together cost them $300,000 in 1915. And that's $9 million in today's money. And that's not counting landscaping, grounds, any maintenance. That's just really the hard cost for the land and the house to get built. So it really shows you how they sort of, went up and up in terms of society. This is a portrait of Mrs. Schoonmaker later in life from her passport photo on a trip probably going to Europe. And then Rosebank, this is the house that they had built there, designed by Hunt and Hunt. So unfortunately, all that glitters is not gold. And Mr. Schoonmaker suffered from what they called at the time melancholia or depression. And he actually ended his life in August of 1918. He had been so severely depressed that he had a nurse taking care of him that lived in the house, and he sort of snuck away from his wife and the nurse one evening and shot himself twice in the bathroom. I don't know how you shoot yourself twice in the head, but that's what the newspaper said happened. Unfortunately, this was a really tragic end to Mr. Schoonmaker. I think part of what happened, and they had sort of mentioned this, you look at the time 1918, they had been in Palm Beach, they had been doing their normal society things, but this of course was the time of World War I. And Schoonmaker had many, many interests involved in the war, making munitions, making armaments, so he was becoming more and more wealthy, but at the same time, these guns were being used in the war. It was just, I can imagine the guilt to some extent that he might have been feeling. I'd also mentioned that Mrs. Schoonmaker was knitting sweaters for troops. She had done 40 sweaters in a month or something like that. So I just really wonder if part of this, there were some newspaper articles saying that the war had been weighing on him and creating anxiety, and that might have been something that pushed him to the edge. But in any case, they had clearly moved on. They had left Plainfield, and unfortunately, a tragic end. And I think this might be part of the reason why we don't know the house as the Shoemaker Mansion, because sort of they left and then there was this tragic end and people probably didn't want to talk about it. We do know the house, though, is the Coriell Mansion locally. And that was because in 1920, and it wasn't until 1920, the house was finally sold to William and Emma Coriell. They rented the house, I believe, at first, and then bought it the next year afterwards. So this is a photo from 1926, as it would have looked. It's sort of hidden behind the tree in the gardens, but they had added these awnings to help keep the house cool on the porch. Mrs. Coriell was very involved in the Plainfield Garden Club, and so she had beautiful gardens around the house at this time period. Part of which I think resulted in a huge change that was made to the property. So if we look at the 1910 Sanborn map, you can see the house and carriage house. They bought the next property over in 1898. And then eventually in 1928, they moved the carriage house from its front location at the corner back deeper into the lot. And they also changed the sides. So if you look at the drawing on the side to the right, the original carriage house was much larger and a large chunk was taken off. So it was a much smaller building now used for automobiles instead of carriages and horses, and that still remains today as a private residence. Interestingly, that redesign in 1928 was done by Marsh. So you have the Dietrich house, and then Marsh is now coming in and doing the work to move the carriage house. So that brings us to the other house in Plainfield, Questover, which is located just down Central Avenue from the Shoemaker house. This was designed for the brother, Joseph S. Shoemaker. You can see a photo of the house here, really just stunningly beautiful, set way back from the street, a much larger property. This is the way the house looks today, still very much intact. It looks just like it did at the time of its completion. And again, since we don't get to see it very often, I wanted to show a view from the side. You can see the double prow at the top, those beautiful gable roofs, the porte cochere on the side here, the sort of archway on the porch and arches on the porte cochere. So originally this had been the Charles Chisholm house, which stood on this property. And then you can see from 1896, that was basically the last year that Chisholm had the house. And then eventually the Schoonmakers bought the property and had their house built, which stands there today. You can see their finished house and the carriage house in the map from 1906. And so this house really was a puzzle to me, because as I looked at the house, I saw all of these elements that spoke to me Dietrich. And if you were following along earlier, one of the things that occurred on Dietrich's houses, and you see two examples on the right, are this sort of prow roof at the gable that comes out. This was one of his signature design elements. So I'm looking at this and I'm like, this is definitely a Dietrich house. And the other thing is the porte cochere. So you can see again, the porte cochere on these Dietrich houses, and then you see the one here on Questover. And again, I mean, this has to fit, right? And the final thing is the staggered arches. So we have, again, this large arch in the middle with the smaller arches on the side, very similar design element to the Dietrich houses. However, I then started to read and there was a reference to Marsh. So I got very confused, and luckily I was able to come here to the library, go into the archives, and they actually have the original floor plans for the house. So I opened up the floor plans and it's by Marsh. And so this was like, I was very confused by this. So I start looking and I'm like, beautiful, it's amazing. The drawings are pristine, intact. This is the front elevation. So you can see here in the corner, Marsh, Israels, and Harder is the signature. However, it says proposed alteration to the home for Schoonmaker. So I was like, So then I started to look and you know, it's working through the drawings. You start with the elevations, and I finally got to the floor plans, and the floor plans show this color coding. So basically the yellow is everything that's new construction, and the blue, which is a little harder to see on the blue paper, is the original, or what they call the old work. So you had the first floor, second floor, and the modification versus the original house. And so what I did is I then traced the house, and I was like, I'm going to figure out what this thing looked like originally. And so by tracing it, basically it brings us back to the Wisner house in Warwick. So it's the exact same floor plan. You can see the large three-sided fireplace. You can see the room coming out, the L wraparound porch, the porte cochere. So the bones of the house in the middle are actually Dietrich's design of the Wisner house from Warwick. And the same thing holds true if we look at the second floor. So I did the same thing. I traced the lines that we saw here. And then we put the plan of the Wisner house up, and you can see the similarities between the two. So this is actually the picture again from Warwick of the Wisner house. So Charles and Mary Chisholm would have had this built for $5,500 in 1889. James Hardy was the contractor. So in 1896 is when it was sold to Joseph and Anna Schoonmaker for $15,000. And that really is the beginning. And then I started digging into the archives and the newspaper, and it makes notice that they're going to have a large renovation done to the house, not a new construction. And so that is how we ended up then with the house we have today. So of course, this was started in 1896, completed in 1897. Unfortunately, Joseph Schoonmaker only lived here until 1899 when he passed away unexpectedly. The house was then sold later in 1910 to Charles Frost. So it really solved the mystery for me of like, was it a Dietrich house? Was it a Marsh house? And now we know that it's really the two architects coming together. And part of what is hard with this is that Marsh copied the Dietrich details in terms of the arches, the prow on the other side of the roof, the shingle work. So he took on a lot of Dietrich's design details to make them match on the other side of the house. Sure, you had a question?
Yeah, James Hardy, that wasn't hard like that nowadays with construction.
I don't think so. I don't know for sure. It would have been just a local contractor here from Plainfield, I think, back then. So I don't know the origins of the board, but probably not. So I wanted to show you just a few photos of the interior. The house is really quite remarkable inside. And I think over the years, there was a designer showcase that was done here at one point in time. So you can see some older pictures of the interior. As I look at the interior photos, if we saw Marsh's, work before, I think the fireplaces, these are in the new parts of the house. Those are definitely Marsh influences. But if we look at the dining room up at the top, that wainscoting is very typical Dietrich, and especially the main staircase that you see. Those gold elements along the side, if you zoom in, are actual the little spiral bullseyes. So that's exactly Dietrich's work from his earlier projects. So the interior has this great mix between Marsh and Dietrich, all sort of coming together to create the interior of the house now. And of course, another giveaway was the carriage house in the back. This was never altered. So this is the original Dietrich design, and it matches other carriage houses that Dietrich had done previously. So it's not just the Schoonmakers. There's actually two more brothers, but that would have been too long to put on the postcard. So in North Plainfield, we have the Brooks family that were living along Rockview Ave. And then there were basically Mr. Brooks' daughter, Mabel, was married to Edwin Hooley. So Edwin Hooley and then his brother Abraham G. Hooley basically bought two adjoining properties. So you can see the brook that's running along, you can see Rockview Avenue, and basically the Brooks house is the first. In fact, let me go to the next slide so you can see them. Number one here is the Brooks house, number two was the Hooley house, and number three was Abraham the brother house. And looking at these again, the two Hooley brothers, Dietrich designed house number two for Edwin and Mabel Hooley, and then it was Marsh that came along and designed the house for Abraham and Fanny Hooley. So the two architects, again, are working for two brothers. So the first one, Maybrook, that we have was the design for Edwin and Mabel Hooley. That was in 1895. This is a drawing of the house. I have not been able to find any photos of this house, unfortunately. If anybody knows or has any ideas, please share that with me. Hooley is interesting. He was a Wall Street guy. He ended up losing $3 million, their dollars, in 1893. There's a big sort of recession that happened. He gained it all back and paid everybody off within 3 years by 1896, and he built this house in 1895. So he somehow was able to dig himself out of that hole, and he was always very respected because he paid off his debts from that time. This is the floor plan of the house. Again, very typical for Dietrich with that large reception hall and staircase. There are some drawings for some fireplaces that you see there. That's for the reception hall fireplace. There's a set of 4 actually variants. So Dietrich was doing these and asking the owner, which one do you like the best? Over the years, this house changed dramatically. So you can see in 1897, the original Dietrich design. By 1904, both the barns had been expanded and there'd been a greenhouse added onto the house. And finally, by 1910, you can see the house is just almost doubled in size. I'd love to know if Marsh did this addition as well. It would be really interesting to find that info. But he did do the house for Abraham Hooley in 1902. So Abraham and Fanny, they were married at about this time, 1902, and that's why I think the house dates from there. It's certainly on the map in 1904. The house is just, again, a beautiful Marsh design with the gambrels. Let's just see the way the house looks today. One of the things I want to note out that, again, is typical for Marsh, there's two things. There's the sort of ornament that you see on the pediment for the dormer window. So again, Marsh added more of this ornament to the outside of his houses than Dietrich would have. That would be my first clue that this wasn't a Dietrich house. The second thing is if you look on that front window, you'll see there's a little bit of a curve in the muntin, and I've got a blow up to show you right here. So this is another trademark of Marsh's designs, although Dietrich did this too, although it was a little different. But when you're looking around Plainfield, if you see that little flourish, that little curved muntin, it's a good sign that it's a Marsh house you're looking at. This is the backside of the house as it appeared originally. I was able to tour this house recently, and all of those glass panels for the porch are actually still in the basement. It's actually a phenomenal thing that exists. But you can see this house sort of is on the hillside, opening up down into a garden and the brook. This is how the house looks today when you see it. And these are some original views of the interior. What's very interesting to me by this point, this is only 1902 it's being built, but you can see that the interior now is really taking on an arts and crafts style about it. The dining room, no, it still has sort of that colonial revival look. So at this point in time, they were really fashionable. They were at the forefront of design. And this is the beginning of seeing Marsh go a little bit into arts and crafts. From my research on him, I haven't seen him go too deeply into that. It seemed like he sort of maybe just dabbled a little bit, but certainly this room as it was built was really a beautiful representation of the arts and crafts style. This is how the house looks today. The dining room is largely unchanged. At some point in time, the living room was altered back to a more sort of colonial look, which matches the exterior of the house. And there are these beautiful dining room windows that you see here. Again, just an example of sort of the leaded glass that was done in the Plainfield area. So moving away from Plainfield, there's another place that's full of Dietrich and Marsh houses, which is Phillips Manor, which is just north of Tarrytown in Sleepy Hollow, New York, right on the Hudson River. And this was a special place because it was not developed as a sort of organic town. It was a property that was then built and developed as sort of a commuter suburb in a sense. And so one large development company bought the property and they brought in architects to then work on spec houses rather than the owners being hired, hiring the architects and building. So these are some views that you see of the time. There were tennis courts. They had their own train station. Unfortunately, it didn't go as well as planned. They built sort of the initial houses and then World War I started and that delayed some things. But what is fascinating is we have this great grouping of Marsh designs that are there. So these three houses that you see, the middle one is the same as the house in Jersey City that had that corner porch that I thought was so lovely. The one on the right-hand side is the one you see all over Plainfield. And actually, the one on the left is actually one that you see here in Plainfield as well. So these three designs, because they were spec houses, the architects would have just taken what they already had done other places and built here. Likewise, in the same neighborhood, right side by side, Dietrich designed these three houses that you see. The one on the right is the sort of that Ruxton, Maryland, Bayshore one eventually. The middle house was built by Dietrich first in Vermont. And then the one on the left was really a new house for him in the arts and crafts style. And this is one that he played around with and did some different work on. You'll see an example coming up in Garden City. So talking about this arts and crafts now, what is this? So the arts and crafts style really began in the United Kingdom, and it wasn't just architecture, it was a whole philosophical movement, and it encompassed art, design, architecture, textiles, all of these sorts of things together. And it was turning away from mass production. So it really, for me in the US, it's a natural outgrowth from the Shingle style. So the Shingle style was taking these same ideals. This is just sort of the Shingle style maturing and being a movement now across all forms of art. There was an expression of structure. You'll see a lot on the interior's beams that are carried across, also in the furniture design, expressing how the structure of the furniture is held together, and also really embracing life in the home. So it wasn't like you were just buying things cheaply for your house. You wanted to make an investment in craftsmen who built the things would last. It was really an emphasis as well on worker rights, which was important. So these are just some of the examples by Dietrich of some of his arts and crafts designs. This was the Red Swan Inn in Warwick, New York, again, in partnership with Wisner, who was the developer behind it. This was built in Warwick, really a stunning hotel there as they were sort of having their big go in the turn of the century as a resort area outside of New York. And Dietrich is probably best known to those not from Plainfield or me for designing the first Craftsman style house. So when I say that, it wasn't that he designed the only arts and crafts style house or the first one. What happened is that the arts and crafts style came to America largely through furniture designer Gustav Stickley. And Stickley had a magazine he called the Craftsman, where he would publish his furniture designs. He would invite other artists working in arts and crafts style and share that with an audience. And so that really helped to market his furniture and also sort of pass on the ideals that he was very passionate about. Irene Sargent was the editor of that magazine, beginning basically in 1901. So, but that had mostly dealt with other people contributing work. And in 1903, Stickley and Dietrich cooperated on the design of a house, which they for the first time called a Craftsman house. And after that, Stickley went on, and every month he would have a Craftsman house featured. But Dietrich designed the very first one. And if we take a look here, you can see the interiors. So these are all drawings by Dietrich. They're the interior decoration of the house in that arts and crafts style, but it's using furniture directly from the Stickley catalog to sort of showcase and how it would fit in the arrangements. So for the first time, you have his furniture designs being fit within a house specifically designed in that style of architecture. In Garden City, this was a house that he did in 1915 for Dr. Sandhusen. The house, you can see the original design on the right, looks fairly similar to the current. This is the entry hall as it was drawn by Dietrich. And then the really heart of the house is in the main living room space, this ingle nook with the benches, with the fireplace. This was really important in the arts and crafts style to have this sort of gathering space by the fire. And then finally, some of Dietrich's later designs. We have a bungalow that he did in 1917 in Altoona, Pennsylvania. You can see by now this is, quite, more horizontal. It's not 2 stories. It's really sort of spreading things out, but still beautifully detailed with the stonework. And in Monroe County, Pennsylvania in 1919, this is a design he did for this beautiful stone house that would have been up in the Pocono Mountains. This is a drawing of the interior of that house. So what's interesting with both of these and seeing that larger sort of country house aesthetic that both Marsh and Dietrich worked in earlier, by the time that World War I came along, that really all started to die out a little bit. You were either the uber wealthy that were living like the Schoenmakers did up on the North Shore of Long Island, having these huge stone houses built, or you weren't. And so they really had to switch to sort of more modest houses, although they were bringing those arts and crafts ideals into those new designs. So I just want to conclude, sort of tie up ends. Dietrich died on December 24th, 1924. He was living on Long Island at the time, commuting into his office in New York City, and he had a heart attack waiting for the train. So it was really quite sudden. But I want to just share with you part of a line from his obituary in the AIA Journal. This brief outline of his career will perhaps mean little to those without knowledge of his personal qualities. He was a man of sterling character, kind, considerate, always a gentleman, ready to render service or give advice to anyone who asked, and to work for a worthy cause. In brief, to know him was to love him, and his passing was a grief to his many friends who held him in their highest esteem. So that was written by 2 of his colleagues. And then for Marsh, I found this, he lived quite a bit longer until 1942. But in the Courier News at that time in June 29th, 1942, dean of his profession in Plainfield, Mr. Marsh designed the old YMCA, the Elks Club, the old Dime Savings Bank, the Rectory of Grace Episcopal Church, and many of the finest homes in the city. He entered his profession in New York, and during his 40 years in that city was connected with many of the foremost architects of the day. So this really brings to an end a sort of quick summary overview of these 2 architects and how they sort of worked alongside each other. I'm sure they knew each other, and I really would love to be able to ask both of them what they thought of each other as they worked sort of one on one house, one on another, and sometimes the same. So thank you so much for your attention. I just want to express my thanks to the Plainfield Library. You have been a tremendous asset in my research. Especially, you know, your Detwiller archive is just phenomenal. It is an amazing resource for everyone here in Plainfield. It's just incredible. You have this treasure. Also to the Wyck Brooks Historic District. So specifically Sarah and Larry, thank you so much for all of your help. John Grady, who was a former resident of Plainfield and a historian, I'm sort of standing on his shoulders a little bit. I've emailed with him and he's given me a lot of help in research and also with photographs. Also the Frick collection in New York shared those photos with me. And also thank you to all the homeowners. It was such a pleasure. Those of you who invited me in or let me see the houses and take pictures. It's just been wonderful to get to know Plainfield and see the care that you all have for your architecture. So thank you.